So we're here at the Office of the European Network Against Racism, and I'm here with Ojiaku Nwabuzo, who's our Senior Research Officer, and we're going to discuss a report that we've just published on racist crime and institutional racism in the European Union. And I'm going to ask you some questions to shed light on the findings of the report. So maybe we can start with one of the findings of the report that the police are not taking racist crimes seriously, and that racial stereotyping is pervasive in the police at different levels. So what can we do to change the practices in the police to improve also the way that crimes are recorded?
Yes, thank you very much for your question, which I think is a really important one. And in our report, we found this is a report that basically did research across 24 EU member states. And it's a piece of research that we've been working on for about a year. And one of the key findings is really exactly as you said. The police are not necessarily recording racially motivated crimes correctly. And this seems to be pervasive across most of EU member states. And I think there are many ways in which we can see improvements in the actual recording of the police. Some good practice in some countries, but a lot of not so great practice in most countries. I think if there were a couple of things that I would like to highlight now, I would say the first thing that we could talk about is this concept of the perception test. And essentially what that is when a victim of a racially motivated crime goes to the police and reports this crime and describes the elements of the crime that indicates that it's racially motivated, and also the victim states that they believe it's racially motivated. That's their perception. That this is how the police will record the crime and make sure that they record it as a racially motivated crime. And I think that would help significantly in terms of improving the practice of making sure that racially motivated crimes are recorded as such. This is a concept that isn't new. It's something that came about explicitly after the Stephen Lawrence murder and the Macpherson inquiry in the 1990s in the UK. And it was seen as something that was quite important, that came after a long review of the police practices, that the perception of the victim and the witnesses was an important element for the police to record and start the basis of investigations on that report from the victim. So that's one thing that I think should be instated in most EU member states. In some countries, they've taken this on board. I know that it's been considered in Ireland, but it can be improved. Nothing is perfect in that area, but I think it's something that could be practiced across most EU member states. And the other thing that I would say that could help in making sure that the actual number of racially motivated crimes are correctly reflected in the official figures is if there is more connection with third-party reporting, And that essentially is where civil society organisations who are working with different communities and have good relationship with racialised minorities are able to collect information and data from those minorities who have experienced a racially motivated crime. And sometimes they are more likely to go to these organisations and report that they've been a victim than they are to the police. And if there were more official mechanisms where the police and civil society organisations can work together to ensure that the data that civil society organisations gather is also collected and informs the police either the investigation or more generally their practice.
That's a really interesting way that we can improve the situation. And you were mentioning the Macpherson report, and that was a clear case in the UK of mishandling of the investigation and the prosecution of that particular racist crime. So moving forward in the process of the criminal justice and how a racist crime goes through that, how can we improve the situation to avoid these types of mishandling of investigation and prosecution of racist crimes?
Yeah, I should also mention that this is not the first report that we've done on racially motivated crime. We did a report in 2014 that we published, the European Network Against Racism published, and we kind of took in a way a sort of temperature test of how practices are in the police, in the criminal justice system more widely. And we found that there were, real failings in the investigation element of this, looking at racially motivated crimes. But it's in terms of policies and procedures and training, that's one thing that we've seen has improved. There has been some investment in training to improve the kind of investigations of racially motivated crime, but it hasn't really gone far enough. And so if I was to say, how can we improve this further, I would say that we need to make sure that there are actual standards, better and clearer standards in place in terms of how investigations are supposed to proceed. And once you have these standards, then it's important that they are looked into regularly. And I think there's also some elements of proper oversight that needs to be addressed. So if people want to make complaints that an investigation hasn't gone the way that they had hoped, or they feel that someone hasn't been doing their job correctly. So there are other ways in which there should be improvements in terms of oversight and making sure that the police are doing their job correctly. And if a victim of a racially motivated crime has a complaint to make, there should be mechanisms for them to make that claim. And then a real process of taking that complaint seriously. And then the last thing that I would like to say on that, I think that there needs to be perhaps independent complaint commissions.
I'd like to go back to the police and the police attitudes with racialized people. And we see that it creates very tense relations with different communities. So I'm wondering whether there are things that we can put in place to change these practices, and is there a way that communities themselves can be involved in that?
I think that, the relationship that the police has to racialized communities has been historically very difficult. It's been documented in many reports across Europe. And it's something that we have known of, obviously working as an anti-racist organisation. This is not new. So I think it's right to focus on how we can move forward on this. And I think it's really important in terms of racially motivated crimes, because that's one of the reasons why victims say that they don't want to report these crimes to the police, because they don't have a good relationship with the police. And I think that first of all, the police has to invest more resources financially, but also in connecting with civil society organisations and community organisations to understand exactly what they need to do in each local area, in each national context, to improve those relationships with those different minorities. Our report covers 24 EU member states. And it's that relationship with the police is very different depending on whether it's a victim from the Roma community or a victim from the Black community. There are different tensions and understandings of that relationship between those communities and the police. It's consistent that it's poor, that there are poor relations. But there are ways in which it can be improved. And I think that's really by starting conversations with civil society organisations and understanding what the local context is and keeping that link. and trying to improve their practice. But it takes resources.
Yeah, I think it's really encouraging to see that things can be done to try and improve the situation. But I'd like to go back to this more kind of invisible kind of power hierarchies that are kind of underlying the whole criminal justice system and the way that they then tackle racially motivated crime. So is there a way to dismantle these power structures, moving beyond just trainings on unconscious bias for the police, for example? And can we hold criminal justice professionals to account when they are proven cases of racist practices? How can we hold them to account?
I think that is a really complex question, and I will try to answer it in some ways, and specifically with regards to the research that we've done. It's really difficult to discuss these often hidden structures within the criminal justice system that that when you look into it in more detail, you can see that there are power hierarchies, that there are structures that impact on racialized minorities differently, but they're very hidden. So when we're going through the research and trying to look at the practices, it becomes quite difficult to highlight what they are and how to dismantle them. One thing that we do know of is that there has been at least an acknowledgement that there is an element of unconscious bias, as you mentioned, within all of us, but also within the police. And there has been training to kind of raise awareness of this unconscious bias. And I think that's a positive move in some ways, but I don't think that's all that can be done, because that kind of just puts the whole responsibility on the individual police officers' interaction with racialized minorities or victims of racist crime. And really what we need to do is look at the structures and the policies and the legislation that have historically created different interactions with minorities. And that can be in the form of how certain areas are policed, the type of tactics that the police use to carry out their work, what is seen as important in terms of targets, such as making sure that people are stopped and searched. And this whole kind of focus on this type of policing is actually quite a violent form of policing. And this is wider than racially motivated crimes, but it's an example of how these structures, how resources are put into the police and into the community that harm minorities and do not protect them from crime or assault or other examples of racially motivated crimes. So I think that there needs to be more done to then training on unconscious bias and an understanding, first of all, an acknowledgement, first of all, that there are policies and procedures that may impact on the lives of racialized minorities. And that the police, the prosecution, judges, everybody within the criminal justice system are responsible for looking at those policies and looking at the impact and making sure that it doesn't impact in a discriminatory fashion on certain members of the community.
Yeah, you were mentioning, policies and legislation, and that brings me to my next and final question, which is, what is the role of governments and policymakers in this area? I mean, can policies and legislation help remove racist structures that are kind of embedded in the system?
I think that's one of the things that, as I said before, we did look at racially motivated crimes in 2014, and we asked the researchers in 2018 to look back over the last 4 years to see how things have improved, what has changed. And actually, in terms of training was probably number one, but second was that there were more policies and legislation in place to that were actually focused on hate crimes. So that is a positive. But I think in terms of what we're discussing, which is the more institutionalized forms of racism, you have to go beyond just having simply hate crime legislation. You have to go beyond thinking that we have this policy in place that's going to deal with hate crime. And we have to go further into understanding how these structures can impact on these racialized minorities. And it can be done, but it takes a commitment from all of those within the institution to going through those policies and procedures. There are two ways which I would say that you can further understand how these racist structures are impacting on racialized communities. One way is to carry out regular victimization surveys, really understand how victims are experiencing these crimes, and also ask questions about their engagement with the criminal justice system, with the police. How well are the police responding to these victims' needs and requirements? Another way in which to do that is to develop standards across the board, whether it's on recording and reporting, or whether it's on the investigation and the prosecution, collecting data and assessing these standards over time. And then you will begin to have further insight on what policies and procedures are more discriminatory. And I think then you can really start to dismantle these racist structures. Assessing how to improve the policies and procedures is really important. And I think that really can be done.
So thank you, Ojeko, for this really informative interview. And anyone who's interested can go to our website and find out more in the reports.